Hello and welcome to State of Play. My name is James Wilkinson, and on this episode of the show I had the privilege of being joined by Quassim Cassam, a professor of philosophy at Warwick University, for an in-depth conversation on conspiracy theories. We discuss the popularity of conspiracy theories online, the psychology behind why people believe them, and the shady characters selling them to you and why they're doing this, the motivation. This is because I've been fascinated recently with the widespread conspiracy theories surrounding coronavirus and 5G, mandatory vaccinations and much more, and I wanted to get some expert information on why they're doing so well and why people are drawn to such things at a time like this. It was a fascinating conversation, so I appreciate you listening. Thank you very much, and comment, share, enjoy. Okay, so welcome to the show. My guest today is Quassim Cassam. You are a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and your work covers self-knowledge, perception, epistemic vices, and more. Your work on conspiracy theories has appeared on BBC Radio 5 Live, Sky News, and ABC Radio in Australia. Your 2019 book, Conspiracy Theories, explains the proliferation of conspiracy theories, which is relevant more than ever. Quassim, thank you for joining me on the show.
It's a pleasure.
So yes, really appreciate you taking the time today, and it's great to have you. I just want to start off with, everyone's got an idea of what conspiracy theories are, but in your book you differentiate from the outset between conspiracy theories with a small c and a little t, and with a big C and a big T. So if you can just give a bit of background to you, what a conspiracy theory capitalized is.
Yeah, so you might start off with a kind of very simple definition, which just says that a conspiracy theory is just any theory that explains some significant happening by reference to the actions of a bunch of conspirators. So that's a very broad definition. So on that view, if you think that Guy Fawkes conspired with some people to blow up Parliament on the 5th of November 1605, then that would make you a conspiracy theorist, because you're explaining something by reference to a conspiracy. So in that sense of conspiracy theory, of course, history books are full of conspiracy theories. You'd have to be mad not to be a conspiracy theorist in that sense, because we all know there are conspiracies. But when you talk about conspiracy theories in the sense that people find most interesting, and in the sense that are kind of controversial, then you're not just talking about any old theory about any old conspiracy. So, for example, if you think about 9/11, I want to say that the official account of 9/11 is a small c, small t conspiracy theory, because it explains what happened by reference to an Al-Qaeda conspiracy. But when people talk about conspiracy theories about 9/11, they don't mean the official account. Right? They don't mean the view of the 9/11 Commission. They mean an account of what happened that day that goes against the official view. So if it was an inside job by the Bush administration, then that would make it a real conspiracy theory. So I want to say that conspiracy theories, in the special sense that we're interested in, capital C, capital T conspiracy theories, are not just theories about conspiracies. They are theories about conspiracies that have a bunch of additional features, one of which I've just mentioned, which is that they are contrary to the official view, or contrary or against the received wisdom. So conspiracy theories are sort of undermining theories. That's one feature that distinguishes them from ordinary theories about conspiracies. And there's a bunch of other ones that I talk about in the book. But I think the simple message is you're not really going to capture what's interesting about conspiracy theories just to define them as theories about conspiracies, because of course there are many such theories, and many of those theories are true.
Indeed, and the reason I want to talk to you so much at the moment is we're seeing, at least to my eyes, I've been fascinated by what's appeared to be a massive rise in people believing conspiracy theories and being shared online. And they seem to be very appealing at the moment. And I'm seeing a lot of things about, the relationship, supposed relationship between 5G and coronavirus, and other things about coronavirus, whether being a Chinese conspiracy to, was it leaked from a lab in Wuhan, all this sort of thing. And I wanted to ask, they're spreading a lot online, they're very appealing on social media. Why are people so drawn to believing these conspiracy theories?
Well, so first of all, it's a kind of historical fact that conspiracy theories have always been very popular in times of pandemics. So this is not the first time that there's been a kind of mass health emergency that's generated conspiracy theories. So back in the 19th century, when there were outbreaks of cholera in Europe, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories about who was responsible for those. Again, the suggestion was that there are such shady characters working behind the scenes to spread cholera. If you go back even further, if you go back to the Black Death, now this really is a long time ago. We're talking about the 14th century. There were at that time theories that blamed the Black Death on, surprise, surprise, the Jews, which is a kind of classic conspiracy theory trope. And indeed, a lot of Jews were actually killed. There's a notorious incident when something like 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the 14th century because they were blamed for the Black Death. So we're not talking about anything quite as drastic as that, but the idea that where you have a pandemic, you end up with conspiracy theories about the pandemic. I mean, that's a well-established historical fact. So then you have the kind of explanatory question, which is, well, why is it then? So why is it that pandemics produce conspiracy theories? And I think there are basically kind of two sorts of consideration here. I mean, one consideration is that conspiracy theories offer an explanation of something that lots of people want to understand. So, I mean, if the correct explanation is that here's a kind of virus that happens to have somehow mutated and spread, and if you then say, well, so what's the cause? What's the ultimate cause of this theory? So one view might be, well, shit happens, right? Stuff like this happens. There have always been pandemics. There always will be, and it's just bad luck. So one kind of person who goes for conspiracy theory is the kind of person who finds that explanation dissatisfying. They don't like shit happens explanations. They want explanations that identify a kind of ideally a human cause of these things. And this of course picks up on the thing I was saying about the Black Death. Again, the idea was that that there are people causing this, and that is a kind of explanation that some people find very, very, very satisfying, and more satisfying than simply being told, well, these things happen, which I think is in fact the truth. The other thing to say, obviously, is that when you explain a conspiracy theory when you explain an epidemic or a pandemic by attributing it to the actions of a group of people, not only do you have an explanation, you now have someone to blame. And that's a very, very big part, I think, of all conspiracy theories, not just conspiracy theories about coronavirus, but conspiracy theories in general, that they are they're fundamentally about identifying people or groups of people to blame for events that might otherwise seem not to be particularly blameworthy.
And I remember in your book you talked about I forget the exact term, but there was three things, and one of them was the causality, in that people believe that massive events like global pandemics must have equally big causes, and it can't just be that shit happens. And people are always looking. I think the other one was the confirmation bias, looking for information which can back up your previously held beliefs. And one thing that really gripped me that you talked about in the book as well was the concept that all conspiracy theories are political and back an agenda. I just wondered what your thoughts were about some of the theories that are getting flown around at the minute, because to my eyes, maybe a lot of them are anti-China, coming from America perhaps, and there's a cultural thing there. Just to get your thoughts on where the political origins of some of these may be.
Yeah, so I mean, conspiracy theories that are anti-Chinese are, I think, are broadly speaking, political, because there is conflict between America and China. So that would be one thing. But I would suggest that in the case of coronavirus conspiracy theories, the political content of these theories actually is connected, in my view, to the rise of populism. So if you think about populism, so since Brexit and Trump, people have talked a lot about this. So populism is seen as a kind of amorphous ideology, which is essentially unified by one thing, which is resentment and suspicion of elites. That's populism, right? One thing that people talk about in connection with populism is, for example, the decline of trust in elites. And conspiracy theories about coronavirus, I think, are part of that populist mistrust of elites. There's the idea that on the one hand, people in positions of power are responsible for the virus. I mean, so there are theories about Bill Gates and who knows who else in this connection. So that's one theory, and then there's a theory that they may not have invented the virus, they may not have created it, but they are, for their own reasons, facilitating its transmission through the use of 5G or whatever it is. And when they deny it, when experts come on programs and say that's complete nonsense, that couldn't possibly be true, of course, you then have the sort of classic populist response, which is, well, why should we trust them? Right? These are just more members of the powerful elites. So I think that when you enter an era of suspicion about previously trusted sources of information, then that's exactly when conspiracy theories really flourish. And this climate of suspicion, not one, it isn't apolitical; it's connected to politics, and two, it isn't something that's just come out of the blue. It's connected with the general rise of populism, all over the world. So that's the politics.
And we're seeing, a lot more talk against, the concepts like the deep state and, the man behind the man, and that directly taps into what you're saying about populism. And it's very interesting seeing a lot more of these. Do you, just a very quick question, do you think these conspiracy theories are becoming a lot more mainstream and widely spread, or is that just what it feels like is happening at the moment because of the pandemic?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, of course, these theories, for people who use social media, these theories are very present. I think anyone who uses social media may have the feeling that we're witnessing a tremendous rise in conspiracy theories in circulation. But actually, if you're thinking about belief in conspiracy theories in the general population, I mean, you'd actually need to do some research to find out the answer to that question. So let me just give you a piece of research that now is quite old, but was very interesting when it came out. So this was some research that was published in 2010, so it's 10 years old now, by a couple of American researchers who were particularly interested in American conspiracy theories. And in fact, their book is called American Conspiracy Theories. So one of the questions they asked was, are conspiracy theories more popular or more prevalent in the US now than they've ever been in the past? So they developed a methodology for testing that hypothesis. I think a very good and very interesting methodology. And what they found was that actually conspiracy theories are less prevalent now than they've been in America in the past, and that we're not in the heyday of conspiracy theories at all. And so I mean, a period in the past where more people were conspiracy theorists than is the case now was during the Red Scare of the 1950s. The Reds under the bed conspiracy theories. And there have been other periods in history where conspiracy theories have been more prevalent. Now, this is a really startling piece of research because it goes completely contrary to what everybody thinks, which is, people are more likely to believe conspiracy theories today than in the past. The only thing that's changed, I think, on their view, would be, well, the speed with which these theories circulate. But the speed with which they circulate is not equivalent to the number of people who actually believe them. Now, as I say, this research was published in 2010, and you could, well, I mean, I think it was published a bit later than that, but it covers the period up to 2010. So you could say, well, maybe things have changed since then. Well, maybe they have, but until you've actually found a methodology for testing that hypothesis, I think that's not a conclusion we should just jump to.
That makes total sense. And one of the big conspiracy theories that's circulating at the moment is that 5G, the new phone technology, has a link to coronavirus, that perhaps it lowers the immune system, makes you more susceptible, is one that I've read, or that it can infect your cells and weaken your health generally. That's I don't quite see where the political side is. Maybe that's again just part of the deep state and trying to do everything behind closed doors. But I just wanted to ask, with things like that, to me, there's so much science out there that says this is nonsense, this is untrue. So I just want to talk a little bit about the types of people, or with the mindset, that would look at contrary information and then start to believe it, because it was very interesting reading your book and you talk about it a little bit. My initial thought would be, well, it'll be people who are marginalized, who have felt a little bit ostracized from society, who would look and gravitate towards this information. But you say it's actually a few factors that can build in to make people a lot more susceptible to believing information completely contrary to what the majority of experts are saying.
Yeah, so there isn't a simple answer to the question why people believe conspiracy theories. I think the most straightforward thing to say is that there's a bunch of different risk factors. So a risk factor means something that increases the probability of somebody believing a conspiracy theory, but it doesn't guarantee that they'll believe it. So picking up on the first thing you said about marginalized groups, I mean, I think there is some evidence that people who are or feel marginalized are more likely to believe conspiracy theories. So there's some research that was published fairly recently, which suggested that among the risk factors for belief in conspiracy theories are being politically and economically marginalized, being male, being single, having low self-esteem, and various other factors that don't look enormously flattering as a kind of profile for the conspiracy theorists. So that's one thing. Another factor that is relevant is if you belong to a minority group that has actually been the victim of conspiracies in the past. So one of the findings is that African Americans in America are more likely to believe conspiracy theories than whites. But when you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because African Americans have certainly been victims of various kinds of oppression and persecution, which might make it actually not unreasonable to be a conspiracy theorist, if that's your history. Going back to your point about, well, why is it that people just ignore experts who tell them that these theories are not true? I mean, that really does go back to the thing I was saying about the loss of trust. And of course, the classic statement expression of this was the famous Michael Gove thing in the Brexit debate. The people of this country have had enough of experts. Now, yeah. I mean, as it happens, I think, to be fair to Gove, he was talking specifically about economists and the poor track record of economic forecasting, and I think that's a perfectly fair point to make. But it was interpreted as a kind of general critique or attack on experts. So people took it as meaning we all need to make up our own minds. It's not for anybody else, particularly a member of the elite, to tell us what to think and what to believe. So the fact that there are experts out there saying these theories are rubbish, that's effective if you have trust in experts. If you don't have trust in experts, the fact that they're saying that it's rubbish, if anything, is going to make you more likely to believe them, because of course then you'll go back and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So the sort of interesting philosophical issue here is an issue about trust in sources of information. I mean, if you think about it, the vast majority of knowledge that each of us has is not knowledge that we've discovered for ourselves. It's knowledge that we get from other people by reading books, going to school, watching TV, and so on and so forth, right? So my knowledge that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969, how do I know that? I wasn't there, but that's what the media said. So that system, of course, presupposes that you trust certain sources of information and not others. That's the basis on which you are able to distinguish between what to believe and what not to believe. And of course, that presupposes that you can tell the difference between a trustworthy source and a non-trustworthy source. Right? Now, if you can't tell that difference, if you're really bad at that, so if you think that a trustworthy source is some conspiracist website and an untrustworthy source is BBC News, then of course that's going to have a massive impact on how you react to rebuttals of your theories that are broadcast on BBC News. You won't trust them. So this is really sort of a long-winded way of saying that this crisis of trust, which is very much part of populism, trust in authority, trust in by authorities I mean epistemic authorities, as to say, trust in people who are sources of knowledge. That is a major part in all of this.
And how can trust be shifted back to these more trusted sources? Because to me and people who are glued 24/7 to Alex Jones's Infowars, trying to get to shift them back to BBC News or CNN or even Fox News or anything like that, it seems like an impossible mission. How can you restore trust or get people to realize maybe the information isn't correct?
Well, this current coronavirus pandemic has been really interesting because if you think about members of the current UK government who are associated with the Brexit campaign and this we've had enough of experts line of thinking, they're the very people now who are saying every day, well, we trust the science. We're going to be guided by the science, or we're going to be guided by the scientists. Well, who are the scientists? Well, they're experts in the field. So we've gone from mistrusting experts to now craving the advice of experts because our own skins are at stake. And it'll be really interesting to see. For example, so here's a prediction. Right? So sooner or later, someone's going to come up with a coronavirus vaccine. So you would expect that all the anti-vaxxers are going to be out there doing their usual gig, right? But actually, what I really want to know is how many of them are actually not going to have the vaccine if it's available. That's really going to be an interesting test. I mean, it's appalling enough, in my view, that they don't allow their own children to have the MMR vaccine. But perhaps the threat of MMR seems a bit remote to them. But of course, when you're in the middle of something like a pandemic, and when you are in immediate danger, that's when you actually really need the experts. And in fact, I think in a way, things have gone too far the other way. That we've gone from skepticism about expertise to perhaps placing too much trust in some of the experts who pronounce on these subjects, because of course the experts, the experts are to some extent also in the dark. So their forecasts of how many people would die, have been wildly discrepant, and some of them have proved not to be accurate. So in answer to your question, well, how do we make people respect experts more? I mean, partly it's a matter of just what the general culture is. If you live in a kind of anti-intellectual culture, you're more likely to face this problem of hostility to experts. So there's that kind of general change in culture that's needed. But as I say, events also change things. And it'll be very interesting to see what the perception of experts is at the end of this whole coronavirus business, if and when the experts are seen to have done a good job. I mean, if they are seen not to have done a good job, then of course that will simply increase people's doubts.
Very true. And I think, it's interesting. Most of the time, I think people think conspiracy theories, it's something you watch happening on the fringes, and it's a bit of kind of fun and games. But when it spills over and has these real world consequences, and I remember reading at the beginning of April, 5G telephone masts been burnt down, and these are real world consequences that have ramifications. I just wanted to get your thoughts on who you think is responsible for information and making sure people are believing the right things. And it's a very sensitive area because obviously it encompasses freedom of speech, and big tech platforms have obviously played a role in this, and they've banned people like Alex Jones from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, does it fall on the big tech platforms to manage what information people can get? Should they be, I know Facebook is looking at re-education, I think they might have even called it, of basically putting more factually backed science into people's news feeds so they're getting the right sort of thing if they've been searching for fake news, or does it fall to someone else to manage what we're reading?
Well, that's an incredibly difficult question. I mean, on the one hand, of course, there are all the arguments for free speech and against censorship, and they I think are very powerful arguments. Although I don't think there's an unrestricted right to free speech. I mean, you're not allowed to to broadcast overtly racist material, for example. So that's a restriction on free speech that we accept. If one's going to put the responsibility in the hands of tech companies, well, I think I would be somewhat doubtful about that. I don't know that they're the right people to really make these calls, and they have themselves been, instrumental in the rise of these theories, by enabling their easy circulation. So now they, I think they have the sense this has gone too far and they need to do something about it. Whether that's the right answer or not, I don't know. I think that the supply of conspiracy theories is always going to be out there. So I think you can look at this from two angles. You can look at it from a kind of supply side and a demand side. So you can try and restrict the supply of these theories, but you immediately get into all sorts of problems with free speech and censorship. So then the other side of the coin is to look at the demand, or the people who consume these theories, and that's where the work needs to be done. I think it's a kind of fundamental intellectual capacity that all human beings have and need to have to be able to distinguish between trustworthy and untrustworthy sources of information, between reliable and unreliable sources. I mean, we do this all the time, right? So if you're in a strange town and you stop somebody on the street and say, where's the nearest pub, and they tell you, I mean, you immediately have to form a view about whether this is a reliable source or not. And we all make these judgments all the time on the basis of a whole mass of different cues. I mean, does this look like the sort of person who would know where the nearest pub is, for example? So when you kind of scale up, and you start to think about the kind of big political questions, again, people need to have the ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. And maybe one thing that needs to happen at school is that perhaps children need to be given an education. I mean, maybe they already are, I don't know, but if they aren't, then they ought to be given training in how to be good editors, how to be good sifters of information, how to tell the difference. What are the markers? So if you're presented with a piece of data which says something kind of that looks as though it couldn't, it's unlikely to be true, or it's very surprising, you need to have a checklist of questions to ask about whether to trust this source or not. Right? So one question is, who are these people? That's a good question. Another good question is what are their credentials? Do they have credentials that would enable them to know anything about this? Another question might be, what's in it for them? So there's a whole bunch of big questions like that, as well as kind of more fine-grained questions, about the way the data is presented and the level of professionalism and so on. That none of these is a fail-safe marker of reliability. But there are more or less subtle markers that we rely on, and that I think we're right to rely on. And the key is to train the consumer, that's to say all of us, to look for the signs, and to actually be able to tell the difference between someone who is to be trusted and someone who isn't to be trusted. So I think that's where we should really be working on the demand side. Just one other thing on the supply side. I mean, one thing that's very interesting. You mentioned Alex Jones. I mean, of course, there are all these conspiracy theories about the Sandy Hook shootings. With the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory is that no one died in Sandy Hook, which is an elementary school in Connecticut, and it was a false flag, and these were all actors, and so on and so forth. And one very interesting development in that case is that the parents of some of the young children who were killed in Sandy Hook have actually taken legal action against people who've came up with these theories and circulated them. And I think that's a very, very interesting development, as well. I mean, as you said, conspiracy theories actually hurt people, and if you're one of the people who's been hurt by these theories, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to go after these people, within the limits of the law.
And you talk about, I just want to say, if people have got maybe friend, relative at this moment in time who are because it could be very concerning. If a friend of mine said, I might not get the coronavirus vaccine, that would be alarming to me. You talk about in the book refute and ignore as two ways to deal with people who believe in conspiracy theories, refute them with more factual knowledge and try and turn them back to the good side, so to speak, and ignore being, if it's maybe not worth your time, just kind of pushing it to one side. But then when it comes to, if people got friends and relatives who are believing in dangerous theories at the moment, vaccines being one that comes to mind, what do you think people should do to get people to, believe what seems a lot more sensible?
Well, it's a very difficult conversation to have. I mean, as you say, ignoring those sorts of cases doesn't seem the right response. If people are putting themselves or their children at risk of harm, it feels like, you ought to do something about it if you possibly can. But as anyone knows who's had a conversation with a hardened conspiracy theorist, that actually is very hard to change their minds. And there's very little that you can say that seems to make much of a difference. What I would say is this. I mean, one thing that conspiracy theorists often say is that, well, you rely on the mainstream media, and why should I trust them? Well, you rely on the establishment. Why should I trust them? So they're relying on a kind of form of skepticism about these sources of information. So I think one thing you might try is, well, okay, look, maybe you're right. Okay, maybe we should be skeptical or suspicious about these sources. But now you tell me, why should I trust your sources? Right. So I mean, I've got my sources and you've got your sources. So your sources are, let's say Alex Jones or David Icke, or whoever it is, right? So now why should I trust them? I mean, if you think you're entitled to mistrust my sources, I'm entitled to mistrust your sources. Now they might say, okay, so it's a draw then, right? We shouldn't trust anybody. And at that point, I'd want to say, yeah, but okay, but we've got to live, right? We've got to make a decision. So even if in the end the conclusion that you draw from all of this is that we never really know, that's not an argument for doing nothing. Right? That's only an argument for proceeding with caution. And it may be that the rational, cautious thing to do is to have the vaccine, right? Because the consequences of you being wrong are actually quite serious. I mean, they might say, well, the consequences of you being wrong are quite serious as well. Right. So are you going to risk getting measles or risk getting autism? So you then got to go back to what the evidence shows. I think the truth is there is no formula. There is no magic formula for persuading or reasoning a conspiracy theorist, a committed conspiracy theorist, out of their theories. It's just a sad fact about human beings that our minds aren't that easily changed.
And just another point that you brought up David Icke as well as Alex Jones there. Something that I found really interesting, it's a great point, is that the concept of conspiracy entrepreneurs. And these are guys who are, making their business and their living off the back of peddling conspiracy theories. Alex Jones is the prime example, who, of course, sells a whole range of supplements for male vitality, amongst other things. He's put out a load of coronavirus survival gear, including, he was saying he's got something which can, I don't know if it was the cure or if it just stopped you being infected, but of course that was banned by, I think, the FDA in America. And it's just very interesting. And David Icke is another one. Thousands of pounds of books and programs and talks, and he presumably does very well for himself of what he does. And it's a very interesting point. Just if there's one thing to look at when listening to these guys' information, is maybe just thinking what's in it for them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a key point. I mean, of course, that's a question that they always ask, right? So, when they want to promote their conspiracy theories. So, for example, conspiracy theories about 9/11. One of the arguments is that, well, wasn't it convenient for the Bush administration that 9/11 happened because it gave them the excuse to then invade Iraq? So that's the famous question that's asked by conspiracy theories: who benefits? Right? So they always say, who benefits? Follow the money, and so on and so forth. And I want to say, well, we should be doing the same thing to them. We should be asking, okay, who benefits from their conspiracy theories? What's in it for them? If we want to follow the money, let's follow the money, right? Not just let's follow the money. Follow the money, you may know, is a kind of famous thing in Watergate, where Deep Throat, the source who was supplying the Washington Post with information about what the Nixon administration was doing, what he kept on saying to the journalists was, "Follow the money. This is the way to find out what's really going on." And I think that's actually pretty good advice. So if you're thinking about, as you said, the business model of people like Alex Jones and David Icke. I mean, I obviously don't have access to their financial information, but I would be willing to take a bet that it's a highly lucrative business that they're into. These are entrepreneurs who are selling. Conspiracy theories are a merchandising opportunity. Let's not forget that. I mean, maybe everything is a merchandising opportunity these days, but conspiracy theories certainly are. And they are selling. The modern equivalent of snake oil, and making shed loads of money. I mean, money for speaking engagements and subscriptions and God knows what else. And of course, if you were completely cynical about this, you might take the view that actually you don't even have to suppose that these people believe their own theories. I mean, they have a perfectly good financial incentive for promoting these theories, regardless of whether they believe them or not. So I do think this is a point that isn't really discussed nearly enough. Which is in the case of these, what I call conspiracy entrepreneurs. I mean, the originators and prime peddlers of these theories. The question we need to ask is, who are they? Why are they doing it? What's in it for them?
And it's also pretty much universal that maybe the conspiracy entrepreneurs or the people peddling conspiracy theories, they place themselves as the source of the light, the saving, the protagonist in this story who is going to save you, and they are so necessary to the narrative in the conspiracy that they're peddling, and it's a very kind of ego-driven thing as well.
Yeah. I mean, you only have to listen to these people for 5 seconds to realize what a tremendous kind of ego trip the whole thing is for them. And the idea of them is that the sources of the truth and the saviors are saviors by uncovering all these conspiracies. I think I just want to say, who the hell are you? I mean, why should I believe a single word that you say? So if we're talking about lack of trust, okay, well let's play that card, but we can play that card too. We don't trust them any more than they trust us.
And I think that's a great point, and I want to leave it on a hard hitting note. And who the hell are you? These guys generally 9 times out of 10 no qualifications. And I remember reading your book and the point about 9/11. All conspiracy theorists there. Do they have any background in engineering? No, or anything else that would be relevant? But I think also just to leave it on the note of pointing out that this has been fascinating, but we are all conspiracy theorists to a smaller extent, with a small c and a small t. And you point out a load of great examples of ways where don't write conspiracy theories off across the board, because we are all conspiracy theories. Because when the gunpowder plot is a great example of one where that is true. So it's just good to make that differentiation, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think this is a really, really simple test for your listeners to run. Ask themselves, do you think that the official account of 9/11 and the conspiracy theories about 9/11, do you think that they are both conspiracy theories in exactly the same sense? Right? And I want to say they're not. I mean, they're both theories about conspiracies, but they're not conspiracy theories in the same sense. There's a difference, and we need to think about what the difference is.
And just very quickly, just to leave it on this, if people listening are finding that they're being bombarded with information, or being drawn to information, or finding it more and more enticing, things about coronavirus vaccines or 5G, or being leaked from a Wuhan lab, and I'll be honest, that's one where the more I've seen about it, the more I've read about it, I've thought, well, hang on, that could have happened, and you just have to wait and see. So what's your advice to people who are finding that these things are looking more appealing, and what should they do? Are there any checks or anything like this?
Well, I mean, of course, there are the usual things about the sources of information and the trustworthiness of sources of information. But as you say, I mean, the whole business about the role of laboratories in Wuhan and so on. I mean, I think that a reasonable attitude in those cases would be suspend judgment. We don't actually know enough I don't know enough about all the ins and outs of that. And I think, if I started jumping up and down and blaming it all on, on the Chinese, that would make me a conspiracy theorist, because I would be making a claim, an allegation, which is not supported by the evidence that has so far emerged. That's not to say that, at some point in the future, evidence couldn't emerge. And that's the difference. Take it easy. Don't jump to conclusions. Wait for some reliable information, and certainly don't go around burning down 5G masts.
And just to double check, just to be absolutely certain, when it comes out, you will be getting a coronavirus vaccine.
Yes, I will.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. Well, I just want to say, Quassim, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Obviously, people can't go out to shops at the moment. Hopefully, that'll come back soon. But your book, I got it from Amazon myself, so it's there. And yeah, fascinating reads. And provided me so much information just to kind of mull over and think about conspiracy theories at the moment. So yeah, Quassim, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks. It's been fun.
Well, there you have it. Thank you very much to Quassim for joining me on the show today. It was a pleasure to have you on to get your expert knowledge on conspiracy theories, and I hope you enjoyed the show as well. Let me know what you'd like to hear next, and your thoughts on this podcast as well. Please subscribe, really helps. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you soon.